in the discussion today is too often and too easily consider the other side of research policy, policy relevance. But before we go into the panel, we have the privilege to have with us Elisabeth Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, who will open today's session. Just a few words about Mrs. Mrema. Before becoming Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, known as CBD, Mrs. Mrema worked with the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, for over 2 decades, and was a director of the Law Division at UNEP, which is also responsible for international environmental governance, as well as multilateral environmental agreements. Prior to joining the Law Division, she was Deputy Director of the Ecosystems Division, in charge of coordination, operations, and program delivery for, from 2012, and for 1 year also served as Acting Director of that division. In 2018, she was also the Acting Director of the Corporate Services Division. And prior to these duties, she served as the Executive Secretary of the UNEP Secretariat of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. Mrs. Mrema's work at UNEP has focused on development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, including multilateral environmental agreements at national, regional, and international level. Her various roles over the years include being coordinator of capacity building and compliance and enforcement projects related to environmental law and multilateral environmental conventions. So welcome again, Mrs. Mrema, and thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel privileged to be asked to officiate this meeting. But before I do so, I would like to thank both GDN as well as AFD for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. And sincerely, I would like to congratulate all researchers who have entered the competition. And I really wish them all good luck. And I want to salute this important initiative by GDN and supported by AFD, because it really encourages our researchers. There's no question that we need active participation of the young social scientists from the Global South for our crucial policy work on biodiversity. Scientists, economists have made it very clear to us all: species loss, land degradation, deforestation, ecosystems loss and fragmentation, alien invasive species, impacts of chemicals are all undermining our nature. The consequences of our global economy as the result are enormous. We really need to act now, and now as a global community. The good news is that the world is heading in the right direction as we're in the midst of negotiating a robust and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework to be adopted at the UN Biodiversity Conference later this year in Kunming, China. Just as the Paris Agreement on Climate galvanized action, the post-2020 framework aims to mobilize the world to protect and restore nature, combat climate change, achieve sustainable development goals, and provides job, growth, and economic prosperity. It will serve as an umbrella strategy to governments at all levels, as well as to the businesses, public and private finance, and civil society. It will also provide a coherent guidance and support with the aim to conserve, restore, and sustainably use biodiversity and ecosystems. The new framework, in its current draft, revised zero draft, recognizes the urgent policy actions needed at all levels, globally, regionally, and national, required to transform economic, social, and financial models. The goal is really to stabilize in the next 10 years the trend that has exacerbated biodiversity loss by 2030 and allow for the recovery of natural ecosystems in the following 20 years with net improvement by 2050 to achieve the Convention's vision of living in harmony with nature. Implementation of this framework will require an unprecedented mobilization of financial resources from all sources, the development of capacities at all levels, and mainstreaming of biodiversity in economic sectors. It will require the involvement of all public and private actors for us to achieve the objectives. By mainstreaming, we mean that we need to impel all economic sectors, including businesses, such as those which work on infrastructure, agriculture, forestry, industry, and mining, as well as the public and private financial sector, to substantially and concretely integrate biodiversity issues in their strategies, in their decision-making, in the risk management and actions, and project development, as well as financing. Furthermore, we need to push governments and regulators to develop enabling conditions such as regulations, taxes, incentives, and development of capacities to support businesses and financial sector. To accomplish this, we really need social science research to support us. And let me tell you what actually we expect. We call upon social scientists to develop solutions for the aforementioned, together with developing the necessary tools and the data that each constituents need to engage. We want to contribute to translating scientific data in data usable by economic and financial sectors, a requirement for the development of concrete cooperation. And we need you to contribute to raising awareness of economic sectors and governments and to develop capacities needed at national level. What this means is that we need your help in contributing to the development of really science policy interactions that will form a critical part of our efforts to achieve our ambition of living in harmony with nature. This is really my call to you. This is the role and the space that we hope you can take in this journey to a sustainable future. Let us remember, by acting for nature, we can all help to create a fairer, healthier, and more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mrema, for this, for giving us the vision and the ambition of what's coming in the next decade, and also kind of pinpointing really what we, what the expectation is from the next generation of social scientists across the global South and the global North. We wish you, of course, we could keep you with us for the whole panel. We'll be very glad if you can, but we know you have other commitments. So thanks again once more for opening.
I'm here, at least for the next hour or so. Thank you. Excellent,
excellent. I would like now to turn to our very own Pierre JACQUET, the president of GDN. Pierre is the 4th president of GDN, and before he was the chief economist of the French Development Agency for a decade between 2002 and 2012, and he also served as the executive director in charge of strategy from 2002 and 2010. And before working at the French Development Agency, he was deputy director of the French Institute on International Relations, IFRI. In parallel, between 1994 and 2012, he also led the Department of Economic and Social Sciences and was professor of international economics, and is professor of international economics at the École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, a renowned French graduate engineering school. Pierre has been working and thinking on the vexed question of policy relevance of research for many years. I'd like to give him the floor to share with us his thoughts. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think it's an important and innovative exercise, as Elisabeth mentioned, designed to combine the researchers' methods, academic rigor with policy relevance on this broad and urgent theme of biodiversity and development. I'm very pleased that we could create this opportunity through this joint program with the French Development Agency. So my focus here is on policy relevant. When is academic research policy relevant? When is even policy research policy relevant? To get further insights on this question, it is useful to ask not whether a piece of research is policy relevant, but how it can be policy relevant. And that leads me to discuss various ways in which research is useful for policy and the various users of policy research. A well-known scholar of policy evaluation, the sociologist Carol Weiss, once distinguished 7 ways in which social science research can be useful. It would be too long to discuss each of these 7 ways, but I want to group them here in 3 categories: instrumental, political, and societal. And my main point will be that we tend to focus almost exclusively on the directly instrumental role of research, while I think that especially in the case of biodiversity and development, but also in many other areas, the political and societal cases for research are even more compelling. Let me start, though, with the instrumental use of research, which is the most celebrated one and has become the dominant view of the effectiveness of research. It focuses on the role of knowledge in directly addressing policy issues. And for social sciences, this can take several forms. In the strongest version, policy is expected to implement knowledge-driven recommendations. But however popular, this view of research conflicts with the reality of policymaking. It portrays policy as a sort of technocratic mechanism that transforms knowledge into predetermined objectives and results. In reality, however, policy is much more about dealing with uncertainty, taking risks, building support for action, much more than applying recommendations, even from the best researchers. Now, social sciences research may be directed to solving specific policy issues, or to evaluate a pending policy decision, or to formalize learning from policy experiment through scientific evaluation, but this is a smaller part of the role of research. And these 2 options, directly instrumental and evaluation, have become the main way through which policy relevance is addressed, which I think is too simplistic and incomplete. Now, in a more sophisticated version of this instrumental principle, research may be seen as one source of knowledge interacting with others to inform policy challenges in decisions. This involves not only interaction across scientific disciplines, which you will do during this research lab and during this overall award program, but also interaction with non-scientific forms of knowledge, cultural beliefs, traditions, experience. And since biodiversity links with behavior in general, this kind of interaction is also a vital part of the use of research. Let me move now to the political approach to research use. This approach recognizes that social science research-based insights provide ammunitions to defend predetermined ideas or positions. And this is what politics is about. Research does not often change policymakers' views, but it helps policymakers to strengthen their argumentations. Policymakers use research to support their priors and inclinations. And this is legitimate and important. This is what politics is about. And we should keep in mind that the policy decision also responds to politics and not only to technocracy. There is an additional dimension. Social science research may also provide an alibi to policymakers who don't want to decide on an issue. By commissioning research, they show that they care. And again, this is a use that over time will have an impact on policy itself. Finally, the societal approach is more akin to enlightenment. Social science research is a contribution to education about complex issues related to societal challenges and welfare. Research feeds into public debates, provides new perspectives, defines issues, supports priorities, and this is what Elisabeth referred to when she mentioned awareness. And indeed, a big role of research, social science research in the area of biodiversity and development is to raise awareness. What are the implications for policy relevance for research on biodiversity and development? Note first that the time dimension matters. In the long term, one might argue that any piece of serious academic research might finally become relevant. One just doesn't know when the knowledge it creates may become timely and useful, but that time may come. However, we don't have that luxury here, and we want this research on biodiversity and development to be felt immediately useful. For that purpose, I suggest that the political and societal views are more relevant than the currently dominant instrumental view of policy research. There has been significant progress in making the case for the importance of biodiversity. However, it is not yet seen as a component of development, a component of welfare, and even less as an engine of productivity and innovation. This requires more documentation. Protecting biodiversity or exploiting its potential runs against traditional views of economic growth and traditions about behaviors. New learning is needed. We cannot expect policy to be feasible without the spreading of that new learning, without new insights about the role and importance of biodiversity. And this is something that research can enlighten. Hence, the societal enlightenment approach is also crucial at this stage. However, in order to become part of the societal debate, these new insights must be perceived as crucial for improving welfare. Not only will this be key to raise broad societal awareness, but it will also help build arguments that can speak to policymakers and that they can use in devising policies. In the case of this program, therefore, policy relevance doesn't mean that you need to end up with policy recommendations, though of course you can formulate them, and notably as citizens, and you are free to interpret your own research work. But it especially means that you need to design your research questions so that they will speak to a non-researcher audience. Researchers can influence the use of research, not certainly by weakening rigorous standards, but by providing sound arguments that can then be used in the public debate. Science policy interaction, again mentioned by Elisabeth, goes through debate. In that debate, your responsibility is to deal with interesting questions and to do it with rigor. Good luck to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for these comments. I think that the challenge is even higher now, but this is why we are having actually this panel to actually break down this notion of policy relevance and discuss it from as many possible perspectives. We can now move to our panel, but let me start by saying that in line with some of the things that Pierre just mentioned, GDN's research lab like this one come out precisely in some internal thinking we started around 2015 on what it takes to make a research project policy relevant. And the agencies that manage research funding, of course, have a role to play as part of the larger ecosystem, because we put conditions on the research that is being produced. Expectations on this front in the kind of programs from researchers, on policy relevant from researchers in this kind of programs, the kind of programs that GDN and others run, went through a number of phases and fashions, right? It became clear, that of course policy relevance is important, but that researchers are expert in research, not necessarily policy relevance. And so a lot of thinking went into understanding how to kind of supplement or combine different kind of skill sets to allow more policy relevant research to emerge. Of course, there was a phase where researchers received kind of a lot of support to produce non-research outputs like policy briefs and accessible summaries of the research meant for non-researchers. There's a debate which has been going on, of course, for more than a decade about specific professional profiles, translators, intermediaries, brokers that would help this function and that would kind of bridge research and research production and research use. Of course, the debate continues and it's far from being closed. We realized, however, that working at the tail end of a research project, so trying to turn the findings of a research project policy at the end, policy relevant at the end, trying to extract policy relevance from a project that already existed, of course, had some limitations. And this is where we started thinking about how we could inform the research at the earlier stages. So shaping really kind of the research question through interactions. And GDN's research labs and policy labs, as sometimes we call them as well, are precisely that, a safe space during the selection process at the very early stage of a research selection process, where we can engineer a number of conversations and interactions that help researchers turn their research interest into research questions, based on also what they heard from people who are on the user side of research. So people who occupy a variety of roles in the policy process. And today we have three of them. Yeah? We invited three of them to join us from different ends and levels of biodiversity mainstream policy. And we're going to discuss with them policy efforts on biodiversity mainstreaming and what they wish research could tell them to advance their work. So let me introduce our panelists. I'll start with Odile Conchou, who's financial sector focal point at CBD. After a PhD in ecology, Odile Conchou began her career in research institutes in ecology and agronomy in France and in Germany. She worked as an environmental engineer in Agro-Industrial Union, became General Secretary of the National Organization of Ecology Professionals, and then a consultant in sustainable development. She joined the French Development Agency in 2006, where she was the head of the ESG and Impact Department of Proparco, which is AFD's private sector arm. And she was also responsible for the development of the French Development Agency's biodiversity research program. This program is part of. She is now seconded to the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity on resource mobilization and mainstreaming. She's also in charge of the program of action for the financial sector. So welcome, Odile. Then we have Elpidio PERIA from the Philippines, who advises the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity on developing the centre's strategy on biodiversity mainstreaming and how it may be implemented in various sectors. From 2018 to 2019, he managed a program involving ASEAN member states and the efforts to integrate traditional knowledge in the medical sector, in farmers' rights, agroecology, IPR, and food system policy. He also does litigation. He's a lawyer, trade lawyer, and works at the trial court level up to the Philippines Supreme Court. He was a treaty negotiator, advisor of the Philippines Biodiversity Management Bureau, and was part of the Philippines delegation which actively participated in the negotiations for the Nagoya Protocol from 2002 to 2010, and in the negotiations in the UNFCCC. Finally, from 2012 to 2017, he was also a lecturer in the graduate school of the Mindanao State University, the General Santos City. So thank you for joining us, Elpidio, and welcome. Our third panelist is Anthea Stephens, who's also, I should mention she's one of our scientific committee members for this specific program. And she spent 2 decades designing and delivering innovative and collaborative solutions that address priorities at the interface of development and environmental challenges. She's currently responsible for the climate and sustainability component of the City Supports Program at the National Treasury of South Africa. She was previously director of the National Grassland Program, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI, and acting country director and program manager for the International Union for Conservation of Nature in South Africa. She has an MSc in Environmental Geographical Sciences from the University of Cape Town and has held positions on the board of directors for Phytotrade Africa, Southern African National Products Trade Association, and on the advisory panel of fair trade and tourism in Southern Africa. So welcome to all 3 of you. If you can switch on your video. I don't know if you managed to all 4 be part of the same, to be pinned to the I don't know if you see all, I don't see all of us together. João, is there a way to have all of us with the video on?
I believe they are.
Yes? Yeah, just maybe it's let me just, yeah, okay. Great, so as mentioned in the agenda, what I propose we do is that we go through a couple of rounds of comments from you 3, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. For everybody who is connected, please feel free. We really encourage you to ask questions using the chat function in the of Zoom, and I'll keep feeding the questions into the discussion as they come. But feel free to ask questions at any point using the chat. If you have somebody specific you're asking a question to, please mention it. So first of all, I think it would be good to start with just a round of comments on what biodiversity mainstreaming means in your specific work. Right, we work at different levels, global and national, in different sectors, with different kind of approaches as well. So it'd be great to have a first round of comments on what biodiversity mainstreaming looks like in your work. And I'd like to start with Anthea, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, and good afternoon, good morning, good day, good evening to everyone there. I think we come from across the world. So thanks for the opportunity to participate. And it's such a fascinating issue, the relevant, how we ensure research that we do is policy relevant. And when is that research, just needed to advance the knowledge base? So when do we want research that specifically influences policy, and when do we simply need to extend our knowledge base? But to answer your question specifically, for me, I mean, there's there's definitions of biodiversity mainstreaming, but for me, it's about seeking to change, to influence policies, plans, practices, and institutions. So it's about how do we change the policies that we work with in the plans that we seek to implement, the practices, our behavior, and the institutions that take that forward. For me, that's been one of the simplest ways of understanding biodiversity mainstreaming.
And you currently work on urban development specifically, right? On cities.
Yeah, at the moment, I'm working on advancing climate response, climate resilience within the urban development agenda in South Africa through our National Treasury.
Can you give us kind of just a sneak peek into what it means to work on biodiversity mainstreaming with cities? What are the big questions that you're grappling with?
It's a very good question. I think in the city context, in the urban context, I went from in my career, you know, we're working with students here, and maybe I can share something as a mid-career professional. I went from working at the National Biodiversity Institute, where our focus was very much, it was a focus on biodiversity within an urban context. And it was about looking to conserve those little patches, those remnants that were critical for the biodiversity structure, for the fabric of biodiversity at an ecosystem level. But there was a much greater emphasis on looking at working landscapes, looking at biodiversity within rural landscapes, and how we integrate biodiversity priorities, biodiversity targets, those important vestiges of biodiversity into the policies, the practices, the management practices of economic sectors that work across wide landscapes. So I think the challenge from rural to urban is stark and marked. And when you're in a very sort of super dense urban space, I think it's much more around how do we know what the important bits of biodiversity are. In South Africa, we have quite advanced systematic biodiversity conservation planning. And so we openly acknowledge that not all bits of biodiversity are equal, and we're interested in we're interested in securing and conserving those critically important patches that are necessary for the functioning of ecosystems and the ability of those ecosystems to deliver goods and services to people, to society, to the economy. And I think, you know, we seek far more in terms of that delivery of goods and services from areas that are outside our city fabric, our city centres. But we also recognise, obviously, that cities are critically dependent on the delivery of goods and services that are generated outside the urban area. So the delivery of water, which comes across boundaries, for example, urban boundaries, country boundaries, depends on healthy functioning ecosystems, you know, in the hinterland of our urban areas. So while we might take a very kind of within the boundary context for conserving species within the urban areas, if you're looking at it from an urban ecological systems perspective, we want to ensure that the ecosystems at a much wider landscape scale are able to deliver the goods and services that we critically depend on. Another aspect of biodiversity mainstreaming within the city context is also to understand, I think, particularly in developing economies where we need to ensure that you know, the biodiversity economy is able to support and sustain jobs. We have quite a number of programs in South Africa that advance the restoration of ecosystems in a labor-intensive job creation way. So the restoration and maintenance of ecosystems, whether that's in an urban fabric, so looking at riparian corridors or or wetlands or coastal habitat, that similarly applies outside in rural areas. So there again, I think there's an important aspect of biodiversity mainstreaming in looking at job creation, looking at how we ensure that the what could be otherwise degraded pieces of land within a city context, we're able to restore those to ensure that we can conserve, we can deliver the goods and services, and we can create immediate and long-term benefits for societies that depend on that habitat. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthea. It's fascinating and really kind of links to the message that yesterday Professor Stensecker was really making very clear that, you know, looking at mainstreaming really pushes us to look at biodiversity in places where we don't expect it to be. In fact, you know, jobs. We're taking, of course, the example of our own country, Sweden, where the problem is not planting trees, but actually making sure that the forest cover doesn't take over everything else, right? Which is counterintuitive in terms of the general public diversity. Now I'd like to move to Elpidio. So what does biodiversity mainstreaming mean in your own work?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all participants, and thank you to GDN and to you, Francesco, for giving us the opportunity to get involved here. As you can see, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not ASEAN, it consists of 10 ASEAN member states. If you let me enumerate, so that somehow I tried doing that in CAP 14, and one is so Korea is not included. So if I may enumerate them, no, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR, Myanmar, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. So those are the 10 ASEAN member states. They comprise the governing board of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. So the role of the ACB is to facilitate and coordinate action by these ASEAN member states in biodiversity conservation and in pursuing the two other objectives of the CBD. And the flagship program is promoting the ASEAN Heritage Parks, these 49 pristine, emblematic protected areas. But lately, we have, with our new executive director, Dr. Teresa Mundita Lim, we have also this flagship program, or main priority now is on the biodiversity mainstreaming. And we have recently developed our strategy on how to push biodiversity in various sectors. And we have prioritized so far, or we have been working so far in working with the agriculture, health, and education, no, sector. And with the support of the German cooperation, we also set to get involved in fisheries, tourism, and infrastructure. So what does biodiversity mainstreaming mean? So basically, we try to, in these sectors, like example, agriculture or fisheries, we try to minimize the impact of these sectors on biodiversity. So somehow we look for ways on how their processes and procedures may be improved such that it will not result in continuing loss of biodiversity, but also in changing the way they operate, in integrating the principles, no, and recognition of ecosystem services. So that's just the initial way. And as you can see, ASEAN, the intergovernmental organization, environment is just one pillar. And there's also the socio-political that deals with, for example, the South China Sea issues, and also the economic. And you know, most of those sectors that impact biodiversity, like agriculture and forestry, is in the economic sector of the ASEAN. And that's what we are trying to work towards, such that these sectors, the different ministries, example, the Ministry of Agriculture, that tries to get hastened approval of, example, plantations, no? So we try to engage them and make them aware that there's such a thing as biodiversity conservation. Actually, these officials, there's experts, they're educated on these issues, but because of their mandates and their prioritization, somehow biodiversity does not get that prior consideration. And biodiversity mainstreaming means putting the concerns of biodiversity conservation at par with the priorities of that agency. So I'll stop there if you have some questions.
Thank you. That's very clear. So thanks for this quick overview. Also, what the debate looks like.
There are a lot more if you want, no? But I'll stop.
No, of course. I'm sure there's plenty more. I'll get back to you in a second. I just wanted to go to thank you, Elpidio, to Odile. Odile, you are the focal point for the financial sector at CBD. I mean, I'm very curious to know, what does biodiversity mainstreaming means to you in your work?
Thank you, Francesco, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all. And thank you, Francesco and Pierre, also to invite me to this debate. I'm really happy to be here. I was part of the first discussion with AFD on this program, and I'm really, really happy to see that the program is running now, is evolving, and I want also to wish good luck to all the scientific teams, because it's really a very interesting journey that you are beginning now, and I hope that you will all win, but that's a competition. So you will see, but really important to be there, and even in the first phase of training and discussion and so on. So yes, definitely mainstreaming is part of my work. More or less, it has been part of my whole professional career, if I can say, but it's now really part of that. And as you say, I'm working more with the financial sector now, coming from the financial sector, coming from IFT, and representing it, if I can say, at the CBD. But perhaps let me explain first what is happening in terms of mainstreaming more precisely at the CBD Secretariat in advance of the COP, and after that I will come back to the financial sector. You know, in the past years, biodiversity policies and projects have been mainly focused on biodiversity protection, protected areas, and so on. It's really important. It has to be more developed, but as everyone is saying now, it's not sufficient. And biodiversity has to be integrated in all economic and financial sectors. Integrated, that means being part of all decision-making, type of financing, and so on. And as Elisabeth said at the beginning, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is this overarching policy for all the parties, all the signatories of the convention, 196 countries, which is not all countries, but a lot of countries, recognize that urgent policies action is required to transform economic, social, and financial models to achieve the convention vision and so on. So that means that, as I said just before, biodiversity has to be mainstream in all economic sectors, not only protecting area, but changing the system and changing the model. And we really speak of that, transformation, evolution, changing the models. And scientists have, scientists and social scientists have really a big role to play, but we will come back to that further. So, at the Secretariat and in advance of the COP, big work has been done to define what is mainstreaming and to define how and where and it could be integrated in the economic sector and be also mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's the definition of a long-term agreement on mainstreaming, that it has been done mainly by a colleague at the Secretariat and with a group of experts. And Elpidio mentioned Teresa Lim. She was one of the very, very active person working on this LTAM. I had also a chance to work on that. And it defines this LTAM, define principles and actions that can be implemented by all types of actors, from government, businesses, financial sector, and also civil society, to mainstream once again, or to integrate biodiversity into their policies, action, financing, decision makings, and so on. This document is on the CBD website. I can send you the link if you want to share to all. And this document will be discussed next at the next pre-COP event, which is called the SBI, Subsidiary Body of Implementation, because that's really a way to go to better or to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework in the next 10 to 30 years. If I come back now to the financial sector, what does it mean to integrate biodiversity in the action of banks, funds, asset manager, insurance companies, all the financial sector, public and private? In fact, that's what we are doing now, pushing them to do things. First, it means, you know, if I say bank as a general word, a bank is providing money to finance a project. And we can speak of developing countries, but also in all countries, mainly is that, or to finance a company also. You can provide money like that, but you can also think about what are the risks linked to the project that you are financing. What will this project have as impact on biodiversity, on environment, on social, also on populations? That means managing risk. Because at the end, if the project has a lot of impacts and negative risk, if I can say, on biodiversity, it can turn to economic and to financial risk for the bank. So first of all, managing the risk, managing also the dependency, because banks are, funds and so on, are financing companies which can need to have raw material and so on in the value chain, which are really dependent on, which are either biodiversity, biomass, which needs clean water, and so on and so on. So this project and these companies are dependent on biodiversity. And if there is a huge problem of biodiversity loss, they can have economic problem, financial problem, which in turn are financial risk and or reputation risk or liability risk and so on for the bank. So that's an important issue that banks are beginning to understand, that biodiversity can also turn to financial risks for the bank. So first of all, managing risk and dependency and impact, as I said, of the projects on biodiversity. The second thing is the thing that everyone is thinking is mobilizing funds for biodiversity to finance pro-nature economy. That's simple to say, that's not so simple to do, because the market is not always there, and there is something really to do to develop this type of market of biodiversity positive risk, or of more classical projects which can integrate much more biodiversity. The example of city is a good example. You can finance a project of development of any part of a city and looking at risk, no wastewater and so on. And but you can also, as Anthea told us, help your clients to integrate more biodiversity with connections and so on. I don't repeat what Anthea said. So that's really what you can also do, help your client to manage the risks, yes, but also integrate more biodiversity in more common project and not finance business as usual, if I can say. The third thing is helping, above all for public development banks, and the biggest one, to help public policies to create an enabling environment to attract private funding by developing law, taxes, incentives, technical assistance, and help to develop a market, as I said, at national level. They can leverage investments in nature-based solution, and that's this nature-based solution, that's something I guess really interesting also for scientists, because that's sometimes a black box and people don't know exactly what is in, but it's really something interesting, and it makes a links with climate also, and banks are really know really much better climate things than biodiversity. And finally, it means also for bank, yes, disclosing. When they are doing things, they can disclose risk, impact, and dependencies and opportunities on nature. So it will contribute to boost economies for people and biodiversity as a safety net against future systemic risks. So I stop here, except if you have a question. I see a lot of, I'm not able to follow the chat and to speak, sorry for that. And I can give up if you want.
We'll do that for you. But just quickly, I wanted to have a second round of in reverse order. So I'll start again from you, Odile, about your expectations as somebody involved in the policy process around biodiversity mainstreaming. What kind of research would you like to see come up? What kind of research you think would be useful to your kind of work? What do you think? What are your expectations when it comes to?
Before I say that, I just wanted to inform all of you that these days a conference is happening. From the 13th to 23 April. That's the 5th Science Policy Forum for Biodiversity and the 8th International Conference on Sustainable Science. And that's really on this topic, the link between science and policy. So I can also send the link and because it's not ended first, and it's possible to connect and to see what happened before. And that I just look at some, and that's really interesting, I mean, for all your teams. So it's really the topic we are speaking today. So that's the first thing. I would say that, you know, a lot of people say now we are speaking of biodiversity. So and above all when I speak from the financial sector, which is for people who are working on biodiversity for a long time, sometimes a bit strange, but nevertheless, and it began because of science. It began, I would say, this huge speak of biodiversity in economic sector. It begins 2 or 3 years ago, and mainly with the IPBES report. I really saw a difference before and after the IPBES report. So IPBES, that's science. That's scientists saying to the whole world, look, what is happening with biodiversity, look, all these species disappearing and so on. So that's the first thing that was to alarm and to raise awareness also of public and policy. And, you know, that's what AFD CEO told me one day. I said, well, you know, that's really a shame to hear these people saying it's new, because I made my PhD on that, everyone. And he told me, yes, but now that's a political thing. And that's what you need, that it became a political thing. So raising the awareness, that was the first point. And informing the policy makers that biodiversity is important for them, because if they don't do that, they are at risk. So that's the first point. What we hear in the field of biodiversity, we hear an important need of data, of knowledge, of capacity building, of tool, metrics, indicators. We need to address threats to biodiversity, to identify key factor for success, need of concrete case studies, and need of understanding and better defining what are nature-based solutions and so on. But all that is really important, but I would say that perhaps mainly for more biologists or other type of scientists. But we know that, and everyone is saying that, and very important persons are saying that to achieve some success in terms of biodiversity, we need to transform the relation from humankind to nature. And that's where you are coming, the sociologist, if I can say, or the social scientist, because we speak of finding solution for transitioning to zero net habitat loss, to biodiversity positive economy at national level and international level. And Pierre spoke of that before, and perhaps better explain that. But that's really what we need, and to define scenarios, to define example like that. And transitioning, sorry for the English, it means that it has not to be done and to be negative for people. There is we often speak of just transition. That means that, okay, evolving to different economic sectors, better for the economy and better for biodiversity, for our environment, for climate, because everything is linked, has to be also better for poor people, for small farmers, for women, for IPLCs, that's indigenous people and local community, and also for all of us, I would say. Because if it becomes better for biodiversity but worse for people, it won't be good. So that's where you are. And that means there are needs of raising, and I will finish with that, raising awareness of all. That means also translating scientific data in data understandable and usable for economic and financial actors. I tell that because I work with a lot of bankers, as you know, or as I said, and when they speak to scientists on ways, when they hear of biodiversity, they said it's complicated and sometimes don't understand or don't have the data that they can use directly. If they don't need, we can see that it's a pity, but that is like that. They don't need scientific data explaining the functioning of ecosystems and so on, because they don't know how to use that. They need someone to translate that. That was my role before, or they need data that has been transformed and used and usable directly by them, by rating agencies and so on. I know that for some scientists, that's a nightmare to hear that, but in the reality, if it is not made, it won't function. So that's, I think, something really important. There is a huge need of training, of supporting changes, as I said, in a technology, economic, and social organization of society, of developing new systems, new theory, new scenarios, and so on. And for that, I think that's a better, and I dare to say that, coordination has to be made between a different type of science, sociology, and ecology and so on, because very often you work in silos and also a relationship with economic actors. They need you, really, they need you to have this data, this knowledge to be, and that is implementation of public policies. I'm more in the implementation than in the definition, because I think it's really important. Policies which are not implemented are not good. So perhaps I stop there, and if you have questions, I can answer.
Thank you very much, Odile. I think very clear and very encouraging as well. Elpidio, would you want to go next? You know, what the second question? What should research look like? What is the research mainstreaming you want to see in the next years?
Thank you for the question. Basically, it will track what Pierre JACQUET mentioned previously. So basically, the research on biodiversity mainstreaming that the researchers will do should enlighten the social connection or the social element in the four corners of that research, scientific research that you're coming in, and that I think responds to the societal aspects of what Pierre JACQUET said. And then I think then where does the human and community aspects come in? No? So basically, like example, we had a research recording. We have a soundscape equipment, no, recording all the sounds of botanical garden at night, no, at UP Los Baños. So and somehow there are some sounds of humans there, no. So what does that mean, no? So what does that? How does that impact on the biodiversity issue question that you're trying to research? So you need also to figure that out. So basically, in the design of research, these aspects, the social science aspects, are sometimes excluded because, of course, you know, you're a scientist. You want to exclude. You want to narrow down your research to focus on what you're after. But afterwards, no, you need to look at that human community aspects, because ultimately we now go to the ultimate aspect that when you generate new insights from your research, so how will that impact on the policy? So this is the political aspect that Pierre JACQUET is talking about. So basically, my take on it is that the natural science researchers who are usually doing this research on biodiversity mainstreaming will now be forced to enter another world, no? Like what Odile is saying, that of course you talk about biodiversity, population, etc., life cycle, etc. But now you talk to a financial analyst. So how do you communicate your concepts? So it's like you're entering a different world. So you have to make yourself intelligible to these different sorts of experts, and of course, basically also the general population, no? Those non experts who are actually the voters who determine the policymakers who will determine the funding. Of course, that's for the public research aspect. So you really have to make that an integral part of the when you go to the end of your research, even if you have concluded it. So I'll stop there. No, I saw some 3 questions for
Yes,
me,
there are
but
a few
maybe
questions.
we'll tackle that later. Thank you.
Yes, well, a few questions. A very interesting question coming in. Before we turn to the question, Pierre, what research would you like to see in the coming years? Like, what kind of research, or what research on what? What do you think could really advance and make a difference?
So, for me, I think well, there's 2 things that I want to say. The one is it's less a little bit about research on what and more about how the research is done and how research is done that seeks to advance or influence a policy agenda. So I was saying in the chat, you know, understanding the receiving environment or where you're seeking to mainstream is absolutely critical. I think you can, you know, if you're looking at research that has policy relevance, you can have research that is policy aligned, so it's advancing particular policies or supporting a policy framework. You can have research that's seeking to influence or reform a policy environment, and you can have research that actually, you know, at its outset has no immediate policy relevance, but might seek to influence policy down the line. And if you are about wanting to embark on research that has policy relevance or is able to influence, I think it's so important to be able to map your contribution to the policy agenda. So to clearly understand where you fit within the global policy framework, where you fit within a regional or a national policy framework, and where you sit within a sectoral policy framework, whether it's a biodiversity agenda, a climate change agenda, an economic recovery agenda. So where does that research contribute? Where is it filling gaps in that policy framework? And can you articulate that very clearly? Is your agenda one of advancing the framework, or is your agenda one of trying to reform the policy framework? And then once you've got that, I mean, I now sit in the kind of coalface, as it were, of trying to institute or advance particular reforms. And I'm in an institution that in my previous life, I mean, I'm sitting in the National Treasury now. In my previous life, it was almost the holy grail of where the biodiversity agenda seeks to mainstream. You know, you desperately want fiscal incentives, grants, fiscal policy that's going to support economic policy that's going to support the biodiversity agenda. And I used to be one of these, you know, biodiversity professionals. I'd be knocking on the door of our National Treasury, desperately trying to say, you know, where's our condition? Where are our grants for ecological infrastructure or biodiversity? But, you know, quite honestly, I think the number of, I'm surprised we didn't get shown the door more often. The absolute lack of understanding of the receiving environment, National Treasury, the fiscal policy framework was startling. I speak with cap in hand, and my colleagues still come to the door without having understood what is a policy environment and a set of instruments and a landscape that is, quite frankly, not familiar to us on the biodiversity side. So I think when we are wanting to advance the biodiversity agenda, whether it's through research or whatever, you know, actually recognizing that you are seeking to change something that is outside your space. So how does one go about doing that? And I mean, I'm working on sort of reforming policy at the moment within my own institution, and actually understanding the personalities and the psychology and the history that's happened, and trying to find where your champions are. I can't just underemphasize or overemphasize the importance of having that. I mean, one might call it stakeholder mapping from a research perspective, but you know, deeply understanding who you need to influence and how you're going to get there. It's almost, for me, more important than the what you're wanting to do. I think there's a lot of what issues. You know, I think having worked in biodiversity mainstreaming for, you know, a good chunk of my career, you know, we're constantly trying to do new things. We're constantly trying to innovate and come up with new tools. But quite frankly, looking at where things go to scale, where are there examples of uptake, replication, institutionalization of our innovations in the sector? I think, you know, it's all great and well to have new ways of doing things and new tools, but, you know, to actually try and track that pathway from research towards innovation, towards policy uptake, to going to scale, I think is also so important to helping us understand some of the enabling conditions for successful mainstreaming. So that's one of the things that I wanted to say. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Yeah, very interesting, different approaches to your answers, but I think very complementary. You know, and a lot about not only the what, as you say, Anthea, like, but also like the how and what for, right? And understanding actually the people you're trying to influence, getting into their shoes and understanding how things look from a perspective. Now we have a number of questions, which I quickly kind of, I think I'd like to group into a few macro questions. One, I think there's one set of questions on how do we recognize mainstreaming? How do we know it is mainstreaming? Yeah, and good mainstreaming, which links to what you just said here about scale and of course institutionalization. So there's a question about whether we have good example of mainstreaming, for example, in the finance sector, and there's a question about also indicator of mainstreaming. So how do we go about identifying easy ways or easy or synthetic ways to understand where mainstreaming has happened, right? There's another set of questions about the boundaries of mainstreaming, right? Because we're clearly talking about, not always about, pro-nature initiative, etc., but also trade-offs, right? It was the earlier kind of paradigm to look at the, economy and environment, right? But are there still areas, and I think this was a question both for Odile and for Elpidio, are there areas where there's such a clash that it's basically hard to imagine mainstreaming? What are the boundaries of this effort? What are the impossible cases, right? And I think there's a question about, of course, good practices for influencing policies. What are the examples of good strategies that have worked in a specific sector in terms of research policy interactions? And there's a specific question on right compensation and benefit sharing in the financial sector. So summing up, how do we recognize mainstreaming? Do you have any good example from your experience of how to recognize and measure it, basically? What are an example of potential boundary or impossible kind of mainstreaming project and good practices for influencing, which I think you already talked about, all three of you. So maybe we can focus on how do we recognize and measure mainstreaming indicators, etc. And the second one, what the boundaries. Who wants to go first?
I'll start.
Yes, Elpidio.
Okay. In the first question, how do you recognize? I think first you have to articulate what is the ultimate outcome that you're after, and then identify the best practice. I think that's the approach that we're trying to work with in ASEAN member states. So, for example, in agriculture, what are the best practices out there that really minimize the impact of agricultural practices on biodiversity, and how do we scale it up? So, in recognizing mainstreaming, you just have to define also the outcome that you're after, and perhaps because basically mainstreaming is just the process of trying to achieve that outcome by working with the sector that you want to target. And I think as to the boundaries, uh, this trade-off, I think this is related to the question of what are the most difficult questions that we have encountered so far. I think for now, given that we're facing the pandemic in the region, no, of course, in all over the world. In fact, this was articulated one by one country, Indonesia. It's basically the prioritization. No? So, do you still prioritize for now biodiversity conservation, or do you address first the needs of the people who are infected? Of course, the short answer that is, of course, you need to address those who have been infected, and then eventually biodiversity will have to take care of itself. But you need to recognize that somehow you need to set up measures, no, such that this pandemic will not happen again, or we will be better prepared. So I think it's basically on which resources to deploy on what problem, and always no, biodiversity is not really on the top three of a typical country, especially in a developing country. Of course, in developed countries, when you have addressed perhaps your basic, like Abraham Maslow concerns, then you can deal with in protection of the environment. But when you're dealt with livelihood concerns and all other life and death issues. So basically, biodiversity is not really up there. No? It's not the number one concern. When I was new on this issue, that it's be the number one, but you're tempered with reality, especially when you talk with economic development agencies, development planning agencies. And then on the third question, there's this question also: how do you convince legislators? No, basically you go to their level of experience. No? Like this afternoon, I was in a committee of the legislature dealing with community intellectual rights. I may have stumbled on some procedural aspect because they shut me down, no? Because perhaps I may be speaking out of turn. So then I forgot that there was a period for comment that I missed, no? So something like that, you have to work within their own or scheme of things and talk to their experience, because basically when legislators talk, no, especially in this Zoom environment, they chat about what they did, where did they go in their vacation. So you need to somehow find a way to what they call that, humanize your talk, and don't delve really on the technical aspects, so they will never listen to you. And then there's this one on scoping, no, on how to identify the impactful actors. I think you needed to do a deliberate scoping work, but you need to do sector by sector, like what we are doing in the ASEAN region. We're looking at agriculture, health and biodiversity. That deals with the pandemic, and then education, and we're entering fisheries, tourism, and infrastructure. So we take it at a time, depending on the capacity of the ASEAN member states to address, no? Because it is their express concern. So we are trying to address that. So thank you. I hope I answered the questions.
Thank you very much, Elpidio. Going back to maybe Odile, one of the question of boundaries is interesting. The impossible things. I think will be interesting to hear in the financial sector. You responded already in the chat that something is impossible. But then you see within the same actor, within the same kind of financial actor, you'll see contradictory, basically portfolio management, right? When you have some actions that go in the right direction, while some others that don't go. So how do you avoid biodiversity washing? The greenwashing, the kind of just having kind of some actions that are front-facing, but then are in contradiction with other initiatives or efforts that are fundamentally important to the way that actor works. I think that's also important, something to ask. Do financial actors have to change radically the way they think about risk, for example? Or is it just a marginal effort, to add one set of risk assessments linked to biodiversity that comes into a larger picture where it might sometimes actually get lost? I don't know. What are your comments on the boundaries question?
It's evolving. That's what I can say. That's true that it's a bit different between public and private finance first, but it's evolving, and there are a lot of needs even in the public financing. That's true that biodiversity, if you look at environmental and social aspects, biodiversity was surely one of the less developed, because it's complicated. It's not known, birds, okay, but why not, and so on. So you have to, in fact, if you want your colleagues or the main actors, and above all the boards and so on, evolve, they have to understand why it's important for them. So first of all, it has to be, as I said before, it has to be translated in their language. That's really something I understood with the time working in a bank. If you speak with your own language as a biologist or environmentalist or I don't know what, okay, that's nice. That's really fun, nice, and so on. But at the end, let's come to serious things. So you have to explain to them why it's important to take into account this type of risk. That's what the people with climate did. everyone was afraid because that was the end of the earth. So, which is, I hope, not true, but nevertheless, we can see a lot of damages now because of climate change. We don't see them because of biodiversity, but I guess, yeah, it's not so, you know, it's not a storm, it's not a flooding, because a banker and insurer understands that very well. When there is a flooding of any company, he or she has finance, it's clear. With biodiversity loss, it's not so clear. So it has to be explained and translated. We always come back to this point of raising awareness, but with the dedicated words, not explaining. That was what I explained to my colleague. I remember training session, did several, explaining why it's important to take into account this environmental and social risk, but let's speak of biodiversity, because at the end, as I said at the beginning, it will become a financial risk, and there is a risk to lose money. And it's not to say that financial people have no sensitivity and so on. That's not that, but it's the same thing for everyone. For a political man, if he sees that there is a risk to not take into account this issue, and that, I don't know, people in the street will complain and so on, the risk will be taken into account. So that's always explaining to people why it's important for them, for their business, for their political life and so on, translating this information and speaking in words that people can understand. And that's really a message to the scientific community. It's important, coming also from any scientific studies. So so that's the first thing. And when it's understood, it evolves. We see now that the financial sector is evolving very quick, even if a lot of progress have to be made. So that's the beginning, I would say. And I think it's interesting to make a link with the climate, because the financial sector is now convinced, a lot of them, with the climate issue, and biodiversity linked to that. But biodiversity has to be recognized as such. That's true. But when people are used to something and when you are near that, it's perhaps easier to explain, because that's the same way of meaning risk and financing. The worst, I think, would be to say, okay, we put 10 million, 20 million in biodiversity financing, good project, the green nice thing, and we don't look at all at the portfolio. That won't make anything evolve. So that would be one of the boundaries, if I can say, in the financial sector. So explaining why it's important, convincing, helping and supporting, because that's really something new and they are absolutely not used. So neither of translating what I said before. And after that, perhaps prioritizing, as Elpidio was saying before. The IPBES told us that there are sectors which are the main drivers of biodiversity loss, as agriculture, fishery, forestries, and infrastructures, mining. It's quite a lot, but that's the main part of the portfolios very often. So prioritizing that. And after that, perhaps helping people to be able for, it's perhaps not useful to put a big pressure on all projects that are financed by a bank, for example, if I just say to banks, because some are really risky or can have very good positive impact on biodiversity. Let's focus on that. For the others, perhaps it will come later on, even if they can have impact. So that's also something to develop and to be explained also, which type of project are risky or not. They need that. They need taxonomies, for example, to understand that. And countries can develop that, helped by scientists, for example. What is a good project in biodiversity? What is a bad project? What do I have to finance? What do I have to reject? So, explaining, supporting, and prioritizing, and so on.
So changing the discourse one project at a time, almost, in collaboration. And this links to another question in a different sector, but very, very close in terms of line of questioning that Sol Fernandez Rodriguez is asking from Peru about, how do we deal with really rooted, what she is calling political ontology, so like truths, really, for example, in the political realm, when a state is convinced that extraction is the only way develop because it's an extractive state. How do you change that? I think what you're saying about the financial sector is gives a lot of hope, right? I mean, but, you see that as possible, and one would think that the financial sector is one of the tough ones to convince. It's clearly, surely a tough one, but if they can be accompanied in kind of changing the way they perceive risk and they understand risk and they measure risk, perhaps politicians can also change their minds. Anthea, I don't know if I saw you're answering the question in the chat already. I'm curious. Feel free to answer any question you want. But I had one question for you in my mind. It's how do you measure, do you have you tried in your work to measure, the indicators, the famous indicators that tell you whether you're on the right path or not? Yeah, whether it's about implementation or it's about scaling up, or maybe what's the state of thinking within your organization about these things? Are these things specifically needed?
So, I mean, the indicators, I was going to say, if there's an area of research that I think is still not really bedded down, is how we successfully measure successful mainstreaming. As mainstreaming becomes more successful, it's more difficult to measure because it's absorbed. You sort of blend into the landscape of something that's done. The stock standard biodiversity indicators that the big, GEF and others would require you to report on in your projects: hectares secured, species protected, and so on. So those are the impact level indicators, and it's something that we really grappled with during our work, particularly in the grasslands program, where you're constantly having to kind of chase the hectares, chase the species, and mainstreaming is about the more immediate outcomes of success are changing policies, changing practices, changing behaviors that ultimately result in, so there's a theory of change that ultimately result in hectares and species. So National Grasslands Biodiversity Program in South Africa for some years, we did quite a lot of reflection at the end, and I was just going back to some of that work. And we did a piece of work that looked at the sustainability of our mainstreaming work, and we identified 3 indicators that we wanted to assess to determine the immediate effectiveness of our mainstreaming work. So those 3, and we mapped them across the sectors that we worked in. We worked in forestry, we worked in agriculture, urban development, coal mining, and then the broader policy enabling environment. And we wanted to know from what we were doing, had resources been allocated to what we were trying to change in another institution? So was there budget? Was there people? Had there been an institutional change that brought resources to doing this work in the forestry sector or in the mining sector or in agriculture? Had some of the knowledge, that was one indicator. So we wanted to understand resources allocated as a result of our work. Had some of the knowledge that we had developed, tools, guidelines, maps, whatever, was that being used and internalized? Let's get examples of that. And was there strategic realignment? If we looked at the strategies and policies, the annual plans, development plans and so on of a sector, were we starting to see a reflection of the biodiversity agenda? So those were the kind of 3 indicators that we used to track the immediate impact of our work through our 5-year program as we were looking to exit. The hectares we were tracking, and we were securing hectares as we go. But if we're wanting to change the policies, the practices, the behaviors in advance of biodiversity conservation in other sectors, is there are there resources to drive this work? Is the knowledge that we have developed being used and internalized in those sectors? Is there strategic realignment? Are we seeing shifts in the policies and the plans? So I think, really trying to understand this issue of, mapping the success and looking at the causality of a mainstreaming agenda to advancing the goals, the SDGs, you know, that we're trying to achieve, when you're not directly, you know, putting fences around patches of biodiversity on the ground, but you're changing institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks a lot, Anthea. Just checking the time. We have 5 minutes left. So, I think we answered more or less all questions, or we'll answer in the chat. So maybe I'll just turn back to the three of you and ask you, like, in one sentence, you know, what in one sentence would you say to somebody who's, you know, starting a career in academia and wants to, one piece of advice, you know, one thing they should do, absolutely. You know, an early career researcher really trying to enter this space and have his or her research have an impact on policy. Is it about learning, you know, what the world looks like from the policymaker's perspective? Is it about really kind of becoming a storyteller, you know, to really kind of cut across disciplinary and sectorial boundaries? Or is it that is really important? In one sentence, I don't know who wants to start.
I'll start.
Oh.
So that will be done, no? So I'll just say to these researchers that integrating the social science aspects in your work will make you a more versatile scientist. No? So don't miss the opportunity to dabble in other non-related aspects, because usually it's those aspects that will make you a well-rounded one. No? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Odile, you want to go next?
Yes, first do it. That's really important as a social scientist, because I understood that you are a social scientist. Your field of research is really needed in terms of biodiversity, and because it's not only protecting plants, animal, but it's also on people, on our life. So you are really, really important. But please work with biological scientists and so on, work in coordination all together, and work with other persons as public policy or companies and so on to be connected with the field. And I know that it's sometimes to be, when you are noted and so on, you need a lot of publications, but it's really important to stay connected with others and to work in a larger community. Thank you, and good luck to all.
Thank you. Sorry for this ambush to all three of you, but Anthea.
No, I wanted to really echo what Odile said. I think for me, what I said earlier when I started was understand your receiving environment. I can't underscore that sufficiently. Know where you want your research to go and why, and spend a lot of time understanding that landscape, and find a champion that you can work with, find a partner, and yeah, good luck.
Yes, thanks. And that's frankly a message that is also very relevant for those organizations that actually organize research programs like GDN, or even also donors, research donors, right? Because, you know, whether a researcher has the time and resources to do that kind of work, to invest the time to interact with people in different disciplines, to map out the policy space that is around them, it really, in large part, also depends on the conditions as well of funding. So what we're trying to do here is of course, as its own limitations, it's the first step, and hopefully we can develop and design programs where, you know, the first 2 years are about mapping and knowing and understanding the kind of the people who are on the use side, on the demand side of research. We are out of time. I'd like to thank a lot everyone. I think Elisabeth and Pierre already left, but you know, Thanks a lot to Elpidio, to Odile.
Yeah.
For joining us. Oh, Elisabeth is still here.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you, Evan, Elisabeth. Thank you all. This has been extremely kind of interesting and thought-provoking. I think, I see a lot of enthusiastic comments on the chat. Hopefully what we gave is a kind of a glimpse of what this kind of questions about policy relevance look like when you are in a policy process. And we hope that can be kind of inspiration to understand what might actually improve existing projects that are running for the awards and beyond. So once more, thank you very much, everyone. And then have a nice day, morning, evening to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye.
for now. Bye.